lecture will outline 4 basic essentials of family systems theory that we're going to discuss today in this lecture. They are on the board as follows. Number 1, families are the primary influence in our lives. Number 2 is that history tends to repeat itself. Number 3, families move through time on a horizontal as well as a vertical continuum. And number 4, each individual must maintain both separateness from and connectedness to the family. Families are the primary influence of our lives. This is what we talk about when we're discussing the family of origin. The FOO, the family of origin. This is the family that you grew up in. It's a family that you learned most of the information of how you operate yourself as a parent, as a child. All of these things are the major influences. So first of all, the principle acknowledges the basic truth that has been observed and discussed in fields of psychology, cultural anthropology, and sociology. So human beings are shaped and informed by the family that they're raised within. So everything from our language to our mannerisms, by the models we are exposed to, are the things by which we take away these things. I'm sure that in your family you have certain things that your family has developed as a language, the things that you call certain things that other families may not even really be aware of. This fact is evidenced by the various different ways that particular families interact, the way that you talk to each other, the way that you argue, the way that you fight. Some of my friends, their families are very animated when they talk, and my wife, when she's discussing something, she's talking like this to me, and it makes me feel like she's mad at me because she's talking like this. And these are things that we pick up early on in our development. One family may have a largely nonverbal or non-confrontational way in which they interact. It's just very laid back and very sweet and very kind. Others are not that way. Then you put those two together and the disparity is quite different. You might have people in your neighborhood growing up that were very verbal in their interacting, very confrontational. When individuals from these two different families meet, it's likely that they're going to have misunderstandings or difficulties might arise, of course, within the context of these interactions, because one thing doesn't look like that to me growing up, but it does to them. In terms of the way that we are shaped as humans entering into our world, perhaps the old adage that you are what you eat should be changed to you are who you meet, you are who you grow up with, you are who you are around. Now, while these influences don't exactly dictate what we will be in the strict sense, they do supply us with most of the material that we will have to work with. You will find commonality with your family of origin. Perhaps your brothers or your sisters interact in the same way that you do. Perhaps you find times and holidays and different things that we all do together because this is what our family of origin did. This is what feels normal. In family science, they call it like an equilibrium, that we're trying to find an equilibrium, or another word for it is homeostasis. A homeostasis is a certain level. So for instance, in your family, if you're a pretty loud family and things are always tending to have volume to your discussions, that's what you like. When you come home, when you interact with your family, you like to have some volume. You like to have it loud. Where other families grew up very, very quiet and very low, and you're trying to find that homeostasis about which you feel comfortable with. Now, truth be told, you will find something kind of in between. You won't find it to be one way or the other, perhaps. You'll find it to be something in between the way your wife likes it and the way you like it. The second item is that history tends to repeat itself. Now, we know this from our history classes. This is one that has been made by the study of history as a pattern that we follow, commenting on the habitual character of the human race. And we are pretty habitual. This observation of repeating patterns can be made when one examines any and all of our family systems that these patterns tend to follow. Furthermore, this repetition can be seen in the physical and the psychological patterns of a family as they cycle through their time together. So if you consider things like family illness and heart disease, These show up as medical conditions that are experienced by multiple family members through several generations. It's DNA. It's stuff that is taken from our histories. It's like if you have high cholesterol, the commercial says, well, thank Uncle Lou for your high cholesterol. These are things that we know medically. The genetic predisposition of particular diseases can be seen as it is repeated and as it manifests itself in the lives of generation after generation. So I come from 4 generations of alcoholics. So in my family, the doctor told me when I was probably like 13 or 14 that alcoholism, in my family, alcoholism is a predispositioned condition that I am going to, if I start drinking, I am more likely to become an alcoholic than those who don't have this predisposition. It was a sobering, excuse the pun, kind of statement to be made to me that this predisposition is something that gets handed down. Now, I've never drank in my life, not a drop, and the reason is because my father showed me over and over again growing up what alcoholics are like and what alcoholism can do to you. And I never really wanted to repeat that pattern, never really wanted that to be a part of me. However, I do see that I do have some addictive personality traits. I have some all or nothing traits. All or nothing is that I'm either into something all the way or not at all. So this trait is really within an alcoholic, is that they're going to drink not just a little bit in moderation, 1 drink of wine at dinner. No, that's not in their DNA in the sense of this discussion. It is more like they're going to do it all or they're not going to have anything. So the all or nothing, this addictive personality kind of thing that I might have is used in more positive ways. I might be addicted to learning, perhaps, or I might be really enjoying watching movies, which I do. But it's not something that is going to hinder me because I recognize this pattern early on. So the genetic predisposition that we're talking about is stuff that gets passed on. In addition to the genetics, the family system may perpetuate certain lifestyle patterns such as stress, poor nutrition, lots of things about, like we said, medically about heart disease, the way we might eat, the foods that we eat because of the way our family grew up. These genetics are things that, again, don't define us, but they do shape us. Similar patterns can be seen in the psychological habits in a family system. If somebody is not one that's going to be taught how to share their feelings effectively or appropriately, you're going to find that that pattern of sharing your feelings inappropriately is probably going to be passed on. Not being able to hold your thoughts in your head and speaking them out as soon as you hear them in your head, you just start speaking them out. That might be a pattern. The way you argue, the way that you resolve conflict. These are things that get passed on many times from generation to generation. Some of the things, as we said, not defining you, but shaping you. You can decide, I don't like the way my parents did this, or the way my brothers and sisters did this, so I'm not going to do that. It's great. However, you do recognize that that's still shaping the way you have decided. Your family of origin has that kind of power on you to shape you. One can observe that certain families produce generation after generation of like doctors or lawyers or teachers because that's what is expected of them. That's what they're groomed with. That's the expectation within the family system. Now, such patterns are not simply the opportunity of or the result of an opportunity or of good fortune. Rather, they involve the values that are passed down from one generation to the next and the particular relationship within the family system. The idea of looking for approval, those kinds of things you see are getting passed down. So for better or worse, history does tend to repeat itself in family systems. These patterns are by no means irreversible, but in order to seek change in these historical patterns, family members, you first have to be aware of it. In psychology, we talk about the awareness wheel of what are you aware of? Why do you do the things that you do? My mother was from Missouri. We grew up in Southern California. So she says liar instead of lawyer. And she says wash machine instead of wash machine. These are things that that she said, I say motorcycle instead of motorcycle. My kids say motorcycle instead of motorcycle. My grandkids, I can never do the number 3 effectively, like hold it there and put that finger together. So I've always done 3. So when my grandkids were learning to count, they would go 1, 2, 3, 4, because Papa was teaching them how to do that. And these things get, again, passed on for better, for worse. And they're not irreversible, of course. And in order to seek changes in our historical patterns, family members, again, they've got to be aware of them. You must be aware of these are things that your family does. And if you want to stop that pattern, if it is a dysfunctional pattern or an inappropriate pattern, you can learn to stop that pattern. You can learn to adjust yourself to a new way of expressing yourself, which, you know, we all do through time anyway as we learn. The third thing is that families move through time on a horizontal as well as a vertical continuum. So what does that mean? At any moment in time, it's like a picture of a family does not, it does include many things within it. But there are certain things that we recognize that this picture won't all include the history of things that happened or actually where we are on our family life cycle, which we'll talk about in another lecture. But families change as they move through time. New members are born and added into the family, and members leave by dying, and we find this pattern this way on a family life cycle, or a horizontal pattern is that we start over here. Maybe we're an unattached young adult, and then we move to being married and having children and moving, et cetera, et cetera. So we have new members coming in, and then as the elderly age out and of this life, we have exits as well. These life cycles or changes are part of the natural progression of families over this time. In addition, these changes involve not only family relationships on a horizontal plane, like siblings, but also family relationships on a vertical plane, such as parent-child or grandparent-child relationships. So you have your grandparents up here, you have your parents here, you have yourself here, you have your children here, you have your children's children here. So this is moving on not a horizontal plane, but on a vertical plane. So as families move through various life cycles, such as marriage and childbearing, retirement, demands for change will adjust the way that we structure our family. It will be placed in our family to change in certain ways because of all the different things that are going on. Certain tasks must be established that are important for the family to accomplish as members as we relate to each other in this particular life cycle. So understanding the way that I am as a parent to my children is going to be different than the way I am to my grandchildren. Why is that? Well, as we move through time on a horizontal plane, as these kids are being born, we recognize that we also go in this vertical plane where, yes, I'm a parent to my children, but I'm not a parent to my grandchildren. I'm a grandfather. I'm Papa to my grandchildren. So I don't get to take everything that I value and the way that I raise my kids and put them to that grandchild. I have to filter that through the relationship of my daughter and her husband, which again is different because my daughter may have many of the same values, but her husband may have different values. So I then learn to adopt to the values that my daughter and my son-in-law are bringing to my grandchildren. And I grandparent the way that they would like it to be done. So there's lots of changes. The way that I would normally handle a child in that situation is going to be different than the way that my daughter and son-in-law are going to handle a child in that situation. So I have to recognize that they are the ones who are in charge of raising that child. I'm just there. Hopefully they're allowing me to be a part of their life in a positive way. So as we move through this life cycle of marriage and child rearing into retirement, demands for change or adjustments will be placed on the family system. My kids worry about me more now in my 60s than they did when I was in my 40s or my 50s. And so that dynamic in my family is changing a little bit. Certain tasks will be established as important to the family as we relate to one another in a particular part of that slice of the life cycle. If they are unable to adjust to the demands of the new life cycle, difficulty will emerge and there will be symptoms of dysfunctionality that can arrive. So if for instance, when my children marry, if I am still trying to tell them how to live, if I'm still trying to influence them so much that it's interfering with their relationships or their life, I'm dysfunctionally acting. I'm not recognizing that my children have moved from underneath me in a vertical way to being on their own in a horizontal way. They have their own children, their own relationship. So one of the things that we recognize and we notice is that one of the changes that happened is you move from a relationship of father and child to a relationship of one family, my wife and I, relating to my son or my daughter and their family. And that this is now more peer-to-peer in a sense, not entirely, of course, but more peer-to-peer in a sense that they are an individual system of their own, connected to the larger system. So if I'm not able to make that change, it's difficult. Or if I, as a grandparent, am trying to put my 2 cents in too much to my children, instead of allowing them to raise their children the way they want to, it's going to be interfering and we're going to have some problems. I remember when one day I was going to feed my grandson Jasper a cracker that had some peanut butter on it when he was about 10 or 11 months old. And my daughter just yelled, she says, "Dad, no, don't give him peanut butter." I'm like, "What are you talking about? You had peanut butter since you were like 6 months old." And she said, "Well, we're finding out that it's not good for them before they're 1 because of peanut allergies, etc., etc." I want to just go, "Oh, brother, would you please knock it off?" But I couldn't, because this is what they have found out and what's good for the child. The other thing was my daughter said, "Do not use baby powder on my kids, on their, their bottoms when they have this or that. Don't use Vaseline, use this thing called butt paste." I thought, what in the world is that? And so this is what my daughter said you use for diaper rash, because these things were found to perhaps have cancer-causing agents because of some of the talcum also has some asbestos in it or something like that. So, these things change and we must adapt and change. And if we're not willing to do that as we move through these times, we're going to find some difficulties are going to arise. The other thing that I think is important is that there's going to be major disruptions in our families, such as illness or death or divorce. And these are going to add to the stress which the families experience and increase their vulnerability to successful adaptation to this new family life that they are entering in. So as they go through time, there's going to be things that are coming up. There's going to be difficulties that are arising that make it very difficult for them to just move smoothly through this. Now, one of the things that family science has found out is that adaptability in a family is a very healthy thing. Flexibility and adaptability, compared to, for instance, what some might call rigid or overly structured or heavily structured families, is that the ones who are more adaptable are going to be more successful. Why is that? It's because we change. It's because we move through this horizontal continuum and it's changing rapidly. For instance, right now, I'm taping this lecture because we're in the coronavirus lockdown. And so we're not meeting in our classrooms anymore. This has caused an incredible amount of difficulty and stretching of how we're presenting this course to you. And in my family, my wife and I are spending a lot of time together, eating meals together, things we haven't done for a long time. We're very busy, we pastor, we teach, we do lots of different things. So normally we have meals either that we meet at a restaurant and have dinner together or bring something home. We laugh because we lived in our house for 20 years. Previous to the coronavirus, we had 3 meals in a row that we made together at home in 20 years. It's kind of ridiculous. And today, I think we're at meal number 38 in a row at our house that we've prepared. It changes things. So how are we going to do during this time? Well, if we're flexible, easily adaptable, we just go with the flow. We figure it's much easier. But those families are very rigid and very hard, that have set these things in a certain order, in a certain place, they're going to find it more difficult to adapt during this time. So these things happen in our life. And in distress, we tend to cling to things which are familiar. Now, unfortunately, this reaction can really do the exact opposite of what is needed in situations where the family life cycle is transitioning into something new. For instance, when you are used to spending lots of time with your kids and then they get married and move out, you don't spend as much time. There's a transition that is very difficult. And then when they have children, of course, you want to be over there all the time and you have to leave room for them and you have to place boundaries. So that's an important aspect, number 3. Number 4 is that each individual must maintain both separateness from and connectedness to their family. So the family moves through this life cycle, which is again from the time we leave our homes until the time that we retire. As the family moves through that, the relationships of each family member to the others in the family will inevitably change. For example, a child who is first dependent for all forms of nourishment and protection upon the parents will eventually grow to be an increasingly independent youth until they leave home and establish their own independence. So they start out as babies needing you every minute of their day, and you attend to them so rigorously. Now that again is a very strong change in the family, where you used to have independence. I could get up and do whatever I wanted to do. Now that's all changed, and changed in a hurry, overnight almost. And that change is very difficult to deal with. We find that we have this need for connection to that child, but yes, we also need some separateness from them as well. So clearly, as the relationship between the child and the parent must change over time, it's helpful if we want it to remain healthy and we want it to remain something that is good for them, as we recognize that there is a need for separateness and connectedness. At various times in a relationship, you're going to find high levels of demand for connectedness, and then you'll find higher levels of demand for separateness. For instance, it's very difficult. I was a youth pastor for 24 years, mostly in Los Angeles and San Diego, worked with families my whole life. One of the most difficult transitions I found was from child, to adolescence. And one of the difficulties in that is because the whole nature of that individual, the child to teen to adolescent, begins to change. Their development moves from connectedness to, and you having to tell them all the time to do this or to do that. Remind them to put on a coat, remind them to wipe their feet, to brush their teeth, to do all these things. When they move to adolescence, their adolescent development is pushing them more towards independence. Because as Erik Erikson will tell you, when it comes to this idea of identity, they're trying to find out, not when they're children, but when they move into adolescence, especially into upper adolescence, as to who am I? What kind of person am I going to be? My parents are Republicans. Am I going to be a Republican? My parents are this, my parents are that. We're forming identity. That forming of identity feels like, and actually is, more independence for them. It's less connectedness to and more separateness from. The tension between you as a parent transitioning from being a parent of a child to being a parent of an adolescent is large, it's huge. If you don't acknowledge that, you will have a lot of role strain, a lot of straining in what's going on. The tension in the family will absolutely increase. I can remember during this time, my son would say, "Dad, I need some money." And I would say, "Well, how much money do you need?" He said, "Well, I don't know, how much can I have?" And I said, "Well, I have $100 in the checkbook. I have to pay all these bills, or I have to get groceries or get gas or something. So I'm going to have about this much money left. How much of that money do you want, or do you think you'd like to have?" And he would not like that, but what I'm trying to do is move him from a child to say, well, you're only going to get this, to an adolescent that says, well, here's a decision that we have to make together. How much of this money would you like to have? That's just an example of me trying to give options. When there was punishment, for instance, for being disobedient or not following rules or not doing some of the things they have to do, I would engage them into what type of consequence are they going to have. So, okay, well, here's what you did. Normally, when you were growing up, I gave you this consequence. Here's another couple of consequences you can choose, or you can add a third. And then we'll discuss what those consequences are. You say, well, that's tedious and takes so long. Yes, but what you're doing is working with the fact that your child is moving to independence, and you want to help them to be a strong, healthy, independent self. So while these aspects of relationships are not mutually exclusive, their appropriateness or helpfulness depends on the present context within the family cycle, the family life. Where are you guys in your developmental processes? So both separateness and connectedness can be helpful and harmful depending upon their context. Another one that we find is that during the time of marriage, early marriage, you spend a lot of time together early on, and then you find that you kind of move, the pendulum kind of swings from all of just being with you and her, or her and you, moving this way to where we're wanting to have some outside involvement as well. And the pendulum usually falls back to the middle, to where you have a healthy balance of togetherness and separateness. So sometime in our relationship, at first it's all togetherness, and then maybe it will move to a period of separateness for a little while until we get back to a place where we have a little bit of both, because a little bit of both is healthy in a relationship. Another difficult time is when you have a child. You were used to spending time, the husband is used to spending time with his wife, but now his wife is spending most of her time with the baby, with the child. And that can be difficult, and that can cause some role strain as well. Where do I fit into this? How am I going to do this? I like it years ago when they moved from my wife is pregnant to we just found out that we're pregnant. That inclusive of we, that we-ness, instead of just she's pregnant, she's having a kid. It's like, no, we're having a baby. That inclusive language is very helpful because it makes it a we issue and a we endeavor. Although the wife is caring for the child. After the child is born, there can still be a we-ness that says, for instance, if her wife is nursing, instead of her getting out of bed to get the baby every night, maybe you can get out of bed and get the baby and bring it to her and then put the baby back. Or move it, back and forth and take turns, those kinds of things, so that we have that connectedness that we need. So in various times, we're going to find that later on in the life cycle, when you're building your career, you might find more separateness from your family as you're spending time building your career. You have to recognize that your family, that may be the time in your family where they need you to have more connectedness. So you have to find this balance between separateness and connectedness, and every person has to do that. So in review, let's look at that. Families are the primary influence in our lives. History tends to repeat itself. Families move through a horizontal as well as a vertical continuum. And each family individual must maintain both separateness from and connectedness to the family.